Hello, everybody. Good morning. We're going to do a sort of part two of a series on the Designing Your Life program we have here at Stanford. This one's called Prototyping for Personal Success. And if you did not attend the first one, don't worry about it. It's there. You're not missing anything by not being there. I'll explain as we go along kind of any background that you'd need to know from part one. I love this quote from Mark Twain. It's not what we don't know that hurts us. It's what we know for sure that just ain't so. I know Mark Twain is a guy that you can get an endless number of quotes from, but I think with respect to this process we call designing your life, it's based on our design thinking sort of innovation process. This quote sort of comes to mind because people that we work with who are in the process of designing your life get stuck, and they often get stuck about things that they're absolutely sure are true that really aren't, and that by part of what we do in the class we teach here at Stanford and in the midlife career seminars that we run off campus is blow up a lot of assumptions that just aren't true. So let's move on to a couple of things here. So design thinking, which is our human-centered problem-solving and innovation technique, it relies on kind of this process diagram where we do empathy, define, ideate, prototype, and test. Some of you probably have seen this before if you've seen any of the other webinars on design thinking. It's a pretty familiar process. And the question is, could you use something like this, which is normally used to design products or services or innovate in industry? Could you use this on something more personal, like designing your life, which is probably the most interesting and a difficult design problem one might face? And you could even restate that question another way. Often when we talk about the class or about this process, people go, oh, I get it. This is really about the question, what do I want to be when I grow up? And it turns out there's probably 3 or 4 major inflection points in anyone's life where this question becomes the dominant question. I mean, I think we're always kind of thinking about, what do we want to be, or how do we want to change, or where what might we do next, which is more exciting than what we're doing now. But the points in time in a person's life, so seasons of your life where this question's become predominant and really, needs to be answered. Right around the end of high school, if any of you out there have, juniors who are thinking about college or seniors who just made the decision about what college to go to, that's a huge inflection point in a person's life, and that decision of where to go for higher education or whether to go to college or not even is one that people really, really wrestle with. Right? And we work with a lot of our seniors and also graduate students who are just about to leave the university. And that's, wow, that's a big inflection point. What am I going to do when I go out of here? I majored in this, but I want to work in that. How am I going to make this work? And what we call the decision explosion, where all of a sudden hundreds of options are on the table, not just, where do I go to school and what's my major? And then you hit a point somewhere in your 30s when, that first career is sort of either working or not working. You either want to take it to the next level or pivot. And then we're often meeting people sort of in the 4th big point in their lives where they're thinking about what people now call an encore career. They've been successful, they've made some money, they've had the job and the accomplishments that came with it, and now they're thinking about moving to something else, that maybe exchanging their money making for some meaning making in their lives. So these are all the points at which this question, what do I want to be when I grow up, really kind of gets some energy. I want to play a little video. We're going to have to switch modes here. This is a video that was actually made by the guys who do the South Park TV series, but it's from a guy named Alan Watts. Alan Watts was a scholar, a thinker, I think at the end of his life a Buddhist priest, and was sort of talking about kind of what's the meaning of life. So we'll play this video. It's just real short, and then we'll talk about it in a second. Okay, so that was Alan Watts' Life and Music, and it's just a lovely little piece about what is the point of this journey? What is the point of this search? And he makes the point that it's really music, and you were supposed to be singing or dancing the whole way through. So we've been teaching this class since 2006 at Stanford in various incarnations to freshmen to seniors to master students, PhDs, off campus and on. The results have really been quite amazing that people really enjoy having an opportunity to have a conversation about their lives and with a kind of a new frame on it. And we're using the design thinking framework. And we're gonna make the argument that, yeah, you can, in fact, design a life. In fact, design is kind of the most interesting approach to this sort of thing. Socrates said, I don't know, 2,000 years ago, the unexamined life is not worth living. And design is about the examination of the way things are and trying to make them better, right? When I was at Apple, we were trying to make better laptop computers. Now they're trying to make better cell phones and better user experiences on tablets and things like that. But design is this sort of relentlessly optimistic thing where we think, hey, we can make a future that's better than today, and we do it by really examining what do users need, what do users want. And in the design thinking framework, we always say you don't start with a problem, you start with people, you start with empathy. And so in design thinking, the empathy start when you're talking about your life is to really examine who it is that you are and what it is that you think you want. You know, and this isn't an easy thing to do, because if it were easy to know what you would want and then it was kind of a linear, okay, now I'll just go get that, this wouldn't be a hard problem. But in fact, it's a very hard problem because people don't know what they want. If you were part of the first session, I mentioned that we're kind of the anti-passion guys. Passion works for some people. If you've got a passion, you've always wanted to be a chef, you've always wanted to be a doctor, and that turns out to play out to be true when you actually are one, that's great. But the research says that only 20% of the people have an identifiable passion. 80% of everybody else has lots of things they like, lots of ways in which they might express themselves in the world that they could be excited about, but no one thing rises to that one overarching passion. And so we don't like processes that start with 80% of the people excluded. But you can examine your life, and you can find ways to design into your future. But here's the thing. I want to make a distinction right now between what we call navigation and wayfinding. Navigation we all understand, right? We all have GPS on our phone or in our car, and if somebody says, how do I get to San Francisco, to this particular restaurant, I just punch the restaurant's address into my GPS, and it navigates me to there. I go up Highway 280, I get off on 6th Street, da-da-da-da-da. But that's because I know exactly where I'm going. So a navigation process can give me explicit directions. The problem with designing your life is you don't exactly know where you're going. You kind of have a sense of maybe I like this kind of stuff versus that kind of stuff. Again, if you joined us for the first program, you did a flow journal and you did an energy map. And we had some people send in some great stuff from the first webinar, and we're still sort of processing some of that information. But the flow journal and the energy map kind of gives you a sense of, well, what works for me more often than not? How do I start to understand or examine which things might be available to me that actually I get excitement or energy around? And so when you don't know where you're going, but you still need to get there, use a process we call wayfinding. I think lots of people have used this term. Wayfinding is a method of figuring out where you're going. This is the way hunters find game in the wild. They know there's a antelope or a deer out there someplace. They know how to track for signs of the deer. They kind of wander around, going from point to point, looking at the next set of signs or tracks or signals, and eventually they find the deer. So we can do the same thing with finding that thing that really gets you excited in terms of your career or other things in your life by using a process of wayfinding, which is simply to say, what do I know about myself right now? What is available for me to try? And we'll talk about prototyping in a second. And how do I get to that next step? And the next step has to be available, and it has to be operationable or actionable. So the examined life in this case is all about practicing wayfinding. Now, there's a classic tension in sort of modern Western world, I think, or maybe in all the industrialized world, and that's the tension between being and doing. Particularly in Silicon Valley here, everybody's doing something. Everybody's got a startup. Everybody's, trying to actualize themselves through doing. but they're not taking any time to examine or understand whether the doing is getting them where they want to go. And particularly in the mid-career workshops, we meet a lot of people who are very successful, lawyers, entrepreneurs, technologists, whatever, and they've made a lot of money, and they've even had a lot of personal success in their businesses. They're the senior vice president of something or the CEO of something. But they report that somehow or other, like in the Alan Watts video, when they got to the end and they opened the bag, there was nothing in it. They discovered that somehow in all this doing, they missed the being. Now, the flip side is, just being in the world, just being in the moment and kind of savoring your experiences doesn't generate traction or action in the direction of your goals. So if you stay inside what we call this classic tension in Western modern society, you're kind of stuck. And we don't like being stuck, so we're going to reframe this as what we're going to call the voice discovery engine, or the wayfinding engine for your journey. We have the original class of this, we started all this, which was called the Designer's Voice, started with this concept of, voice. Who am I? Who's my authentic person? When I speak about something, when I talk about something, I have a voice, a sort of authenticity when the things I'm saying are true for me. And so, when you're trying to figure out where you're going, you have to sort of try to untangle all the different things that are interesting to you, or things that make you stuck, or whatever, and this we call, which is sort of voice discovery, or your path discovery. And we reframe the classic tension between being and doing into what we're going to call the being, doing, becoming cycle, right? So this engine, which continues to rotate constantly in your life, overcomes the false dichotomy of I can either be achieving or I can be experiencing. It's really not the way it works. The way it works for people, and the way you discover a passion or you discover the thing that you want to do next, is through this being, doing, and becoming. So I do stuff in the world. I take action. I make a prototype. I flow journal. I do my other practices and exercises to try to figure out what I like, right? To sort of navigate towards the next thing. In the process of doing these things, I change who I am. I change what's possible for me. And then in the process of that change, I become and rest in a state of a new awareness. My enjoyment is increased. My ability to savor has been amplified. So it's sort of like, I've had season tickets to the ballet. My wife and I love the ballet. We go every year. And a couple of years ago, the ballet started putting little short videos up prior to each performance, which showed a little piece of the performance from the previous year, a little voiceover dialogue from the conductor about what the music was all about, from the choreographer about what the dance was all about. And I found that by just discovering that and then watching that little 8 or 9 minute thing before the ballet, all of a sudden my enjoyment of the ballet is significantly increased, right? Because I have done something, I've become a more adept connoisseur of the ballet, and now my enjoyment, my being at the ballet is completely different experience. So if you just take this reframe from the false dichotomy of I'm either doing something or I'm being something, but I can't be both at the same time, and realize it's actually a cyclical process, that's the first step, first reframe. Now, if you're going to design stuff, you're going to make decisions. Design is really, if you just boil it all down, forget our diagrams and everything else, design is just a series of decisions. I want to make a new coffee cup. I have to make a series of decisions. What's going to be different? What will be new? Will it be bigger or smaller? Will it be made of paper or ceramic? So all these decisions add up to design. But how do I know I'm making a good decision? This is the big thing people wrestle with when they're stuck. They go, wow, I've got all these different things I could do, but I don't know how to make a good decision. And we're going to argue that in order to make a good decision, you need more than just your logic. Because, the questions you're asking yourself about life don't always resolve just by looking at them logically. So we have this notion that the examined life requires examination, and therefore you're going to have to get good at this. You're going to have to develop some practices. That this reflective practice, the practice of being able to sort of do what we call discernment, is critical to insight and decision-making, and that discernment empowers a lot of things, including how to get information from the community around you and how to get information from your mentors. So the keys to this practice and discernment thing is paying attention. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, and then ways of knowing. How do we know when we've made a good decision? How do we know when the decision is right for us? Paying attention. Paying attention is part of this being and becoming engine, and paying attention has two parts. Noticing, which is attending to things while they're happening at the time, being present in the awareness of your experience right now, and reflection, which is attending in retrospect. So being present in the moment, attending in the moment, and then reflecting, spending some time each day reflecting on your experience. Several people who talk about time management and who talk about being an effective leader and effective manager say that one of the most powerful things you can do is after every meeting, after every engagement, after every interview, or every sort of chunk of your day, stop for a moment, just a few moments, and write down the 2 or 3 things that you learned in that moment, or the things that stand out for you. And if you just get this practice of reflection going every day, you become a much better manager, a much better listener, a much better parent, partner, whatever. So we're gonna talk to this issue of noticing and reflecting, because it's critical to having your discernment work on your behalf. So decision making, integrating multiple ways of knowing, this attention to the present and in reflection, is what we call discernment. And having discernment is a little different than just having good judgment, because I think it takes into account that we know things in ways that are more complex than simply the logical or rational ways that we know things. So we're going to talk about discernment as soon as we get the next slide. Okay. So the cognitive ways we know things, and this is our rational mind. Very powerful. We are, first and foremost, I think, rational creatures, or certainly we rely on what we can observe directly and what we have awareness of in that observations. And that's, making pros and cons list about a decision, looking at its advantages and disadvantages, looking at long-term and short-term impacts of a decision we want to make. This is critical, because without this kind of data, it's hard to really sort through the cloud of all the data that's in front of us to make a decision. But there's other ways of knowing as well, which we're going to just put under the affective category. We have emotional intelligence. I cut a short video out of this piece by a guy named Dan Goleman. Dan Goleman is a psychologist who developed the concept of emotional intelligence and has written quite a bit on it. He's got a couple of great TED Talks. But one of the talks that I didn't put the video in for, he talks about the fact that there's a part of our brain, which is a fairly primitive part of our brain, called the basal ganglia, which is the place that sort of assesses how decisions worked and kind of comes up with what he calls a valence for decisions. I just made this decision, and these were the reactions, and that was a positive set of reactions, so I've stored, that pattern in my basal ganglia. This decision didn't work out so well. People were upset. They were angry, so I stored that. And it kind of creates an emotional map for how decisions have impacted us in the past, and it becomes part of your decision-making process. In fact, he reports on a guy who had a brain lesion where this part of the brain was separated from other parts and no longer available. And this guy couldn't make decisions at all, although his IQ was still, 120 or 130. He's a very smart person. He didn't have the ability to make decisions because he had no emotional valence on the decisions. So emotional intelligence, which comes from parts of the brain that don't have direct access to the part of your brain that talks to you, the part that's listening to me, the part that's kind of thinking about what I'm saying, that part, which is your consciousness, your awareness, is only a very small fraction of the processing that's going on about information. And some of the processing that goes on in the lower brain, amygdala for fight, flight, or freeze response, the basal ganglia for emotional valence. This kind of information comes to you. Actually, it's connected to your GI tract, to your gut. It's connected to other parts of your body. So these feelings you get in your body are, in fact, accurate representations of data that you need to include in your decision making. We also have, sort of spiritual and however you want to interpret that, sort of information you get in other ways of knowing, and intuitive. Carl Jung, the great psychologist, said intuition is a form of perception, but it's perception primarily mediated through the unconscious. So we get a lot of data, we process a lot of data, but only a small fraction of it comes into our conscious thinking. The rest of it is used sort of as intuitive thinking, and although we don't spend as much time giving value to that in our culture, in most cultures prior to sort of industrialized Western world, intuition was considered a powerful form of information for decision making. And then there's the kinesthetic and physical kinds of things that we know. We know in our bodies, we know through movement. We are embodied intelligences. We are over-relying on just the part of that little 3-pound bag of neurons in our brain, but the rest of our body has a tremendous amount of intelligence as well. So tuning into these multiple ways of knowing gives us a much more powerful discernment engine. Indicators of knowing, recognition, internal intuition, the aha or epiphany moment, simultaneity, and gut feelings. We are massively visual creatures. We are pattern matching creatures. We can match patterns for faces, for people, for emotional states instantaneously, far faster than any of our most powerful computers. So this notion of recognizing something is powerful because the sense of recognition, that's the answer, or that's the interesting piece of information. That's actually that sense of recognition is being triggered from this massive database of pattern matching. The internal intuition and conscious knowing, I mentioned Jung's statement that intuition is a perception via the unconscious. A tremendous amount of information is being processed below the level of the part of your brain that talks to you, but it is still valencing your opinions. In fact, there's a lot of data now from the behavioral psychologists that decisions are made a half a second or more before you actually become aware of them. So the decisions that you're aware of were actually made previously, and you're just being notified of them. They're being made in your unconscious, the unconscious parts of your brain. And when I use the term unconscious, I'm not speaking of things that are not active. I'm not speaking of a Freudian unconscious or anything like that. It's just the part of your brain that doesn't talk to the part of your brain that's talking to you, the part that you have awareness of. This aha or insight or epiphany moment, described in science, described in sports, described in almost every form of human endeavor. It is a real moment. It's a sudden recognition, unlike the subtle or slow recognition formats before. Critical to figuring out if something is right for you. These sudden moments of aha or insight are really important to listen to. Simultaneity is this notion that, ever notice that after you buy a car, then all of a sudden you notice all these other cars on the road that are just like the one you bought? It's not that anything changed; it's just your awareness changed. When you're trying to trying to come up with a decision about what to do next, and suddenly, a whole series of seemingly disconnected simultaneous events occur in the world, and they're all about the thing you're trying to figure out. It's not that suddenly the world changed. It's that suddenly your pre-filtering has changed, and you're starting to notice things that are biased towards maybe a potential new direction for yourself. So simultaneity is a critical thing to pay attention to, and these idea of gut feelings, which are emotional valences that your body's telling you about certain ideas. So recognition, intuition, epiphany moments, simultaneity, and gut feelings, critical to developing accurate discernments. The forms of doing this, how do you build skills in discernment? How do you build the muscle of examining your life in a way that doesn't just create more confusion? We use lots of different things in the classes. We talked about flow reflection in the section 1 of this webinar series. We talked about what we call an energy mapping things that give you or take energy away. People have, of course, for years and years used meditation, have used music, exercises, things like yoga as part of their discernment practices. I'm going to speak just to two parts of this in addition to what we did last time, the gratefulness exercises and prototyping. So the gratefulness exercises come directly from the positive psychology folks, Martin Seligman, Csikszentmihalyi, Dan Goleman, and others. And it turns out to be one of the simplest things. Again, this is not in, some people do this in terms of a spiritual practice or even a yoga practice. None of those, if you do it that way, that's fine, but none of that's necessary. It turns out to be just a very, very simple thing. As I mentioned in the first session, your brain weighs about 2.5, 3 pounds in an average human, a grown human. That's 2 or 3% of your body weight. It's not a very significant organ in terms of size. But in terms of energy, it consumes 25% of the energy your body it consumes every day. So you run on about 2,000 calories a day, and your brain consumes 500 calories of that. So it's evolved over time to sort of use as much energy as is possible. If you use more than that, probably the rest of the body wouldn't have enough energy to run. But even so, that's not much. That's sort of like translate that to a 40-watt light bulb. So the brain is very, parsimonious in terms of how it uses its attention. And most of the time, you're not actually attending to things very much. You're just sort of processing and moving forward because your brain likes to be lazy. So this gratefulness exercise seems to work, and there's tons and tons of evidence from modern psychology now that this will significantly change a person's mood or set point. I mean, everybody has a certain set point. You can't turn a Tigger into an Eeyore or an Eeyore into a Tigger or a Pooh. But whatever your set point is, you can maximize your sense of well-being, your sense of thriving, your sense of happiness by simply spending some time in a couple of structured ways to redirect your attention to things that are more positive. This exercise is an exercise in that regard, and it's really quite simple. Just set aside 10 minutes, even 5 minutes a day, but it's important because it's a practice that it becomes a regularly practiced thing, an everyday occurrence. Leave a journal or a piece of paper or something next to your bed, or whenever you have that, a glass of wine or whatever at the end of the day. Set aside 10 minutes and think about your day, recall the day, and look for things or episodes, experiences, little moments of things that you are grateful for. Jot down 2 to 5 of these events or exchanges every day, and then focus on them, relive the experience of that moment, just kind of re-savor it, repeat until all your moments are complete, and that's it. And then every week or so on the weekend, maybe scan that list of things that you're grateful for. If you have 2 every day, you'll have 10 or 14 moments where something happened that you were grateful for, and we're looking for patterns. So we're going to use both attention, in reflective attention, looking back on something, and then we're going to use the pattern matching skill that we are innately born with to see if we can find a pattern in this set of episodes that we're grateful for. Now, this can be super simple things, like the lady at Starbucks smiled when she handed me my coffee and said, "Have a nice day," and I just noticed that was sweet. Or, I forgot my headphones on the bus, and I was just about to get off the bus, and somebody next to me said, "Oh, did you drop these?" And it was like, "Oh, that's great," because I lose stuff on all the time, and it's nice when someone picks something up for me. So it doesn't have to be, somebody, rescued my dog or, saved my life. This is just small interventions in the day where you're going to try to look for a positive bias. The data says that if you do this and you make this a regular part of your practice, within 6 to 8 weeks, if this becomes a habit, and psychology tells us it takes about 8 weeks to form a new habit, people surveyed pre and post this simple practice have a significantly higher sense of well-being, a significantly higher sense of energy, a significantly higher sense of their happiness and sort of agency in the world. When that starts to happen, and you notice patterns of these behaviors, you will start to unconsciously provoke these behaviors in yourself and others. And that will lead to new opportunities for prototypes, new things that you could try. And that starts you on the path of wayfinding yourself into the next, version of you when you grow up. Which brings us to the final thing that in the design thinking paradigm, we spent a lot of time talking about prototyping. You can prototype new products, new experiences. When the whole notion of design thinking is if we're going to invent something new, we're kind of inventing the future, but you can't get any data about the future. Nobody knew what the iPhone was until they started sort of tinkering around and building prototypes and trying different things. And if you read the first biography of Steve Jobs, you know that he turned the iPhone down 3 times because it wasn't good enough. So it was a constant and relentless process of prototyping and trying things and saying, is this what's going to work? And then when we say, is this what's going to work, we show it to lots of people. And then they change their mind about what they want, and then they tell us new things, and then we just keep doing that until we finally invent something that people recognize. They go, oh, that's what I wanted. Well, that's what we're going to try to do with prototyping our way forward in our lives. We say, at the D-School, we say, building is thinking. It's not that we think of something and then go make a model of it and say, how about this? We actually use the process of modeling or prototyping to think our way forward. So this is a form of practice in life design, prototyping. Prototypes are experiences that you design to ask an interesting question. So this isn't just necessarily completely solve the problem, although sometimes prototypes do end up solving a problem or a question that you've got. But mostly we create prototypes to ask an interesting question. What would it be like? I've got a lot of students who come to Stanford and they want to become, they enter the pre-medical major. We have a couple of majors here that you can do for pre-med because they want to be doctors. And I go, why do you want to be a doctor? And they go, I don't know, I've always wanted to be a doctor. And I go, that's great. Do you have any idea what a doctor actually does every day? And they go, no. I go, well, that's an easy question to ask. What does a doctor do every day? And since we have a big medical school here and the doctors are always looking for students to work in their labs, it's pretty easy to go find out. It's pretty easy to go get an opportunity to shadow a doctor or spend an hour with a doctor interviewing a dozen doctors and finding out what they actually do every day. Interesting, in that situation, most of my students come back and go, wow, mostly it's really boring. I mean, the part about surgery was cool, but all the rest of it seems really boring. So a prototype is a thing you design to ask an interesting questions. They're really the only way we know to get data about your possible future, and you want them to be as low resolution and as brief and as inexpensive in both your time and your money as possible because you want to run lots and lots and lots of prototypes. It's this design, iterate, building your way forward is the methodology. And so you're constantly looking for ways to say, well, what's available? What is possible for me to do? Can I get a hold of a doctor? Can I get a hold of a person who does this thing I'm interested in doing and spend some time with them? And Michael Schrage, who wrote a book at MIT Press called Serious Play, has done a whole PhD study on how prototyping impacts the quality of design. So it's a great book, and he says, the value of prototypes rely less in the models themselves, the things you create, but in the interactions they invite. You often go out asking one question with your prototype and come back with a whole bunch of different answers to other questions that turned out to be more important than the one you thought you were asking. So forms of practice for this, examples of prototyping in a life design scenario are an information interview. 80% of the jobs are never listed. And so people who say, I've sent a resume into everything on the internet and I didn't even get any answers back. I go, great. Well, you've only hit 20% of the possible opportunities out there, and the rest you're not going to find on the internet. And by the way, just as a tip, sending resumes into internet posted jobs has about a 2 to 5% hit rate. So you can send in 100 and maybe get 2 answers back, and that don't even lead to interviews. And also, by the way, about half of the jobs that are listed on the internet have already been filled in that most companies have a practice of saying, hey, if you want to hire somebody, you have to post the job. So if I know I want to hire Corinne to be my, my facilitator for my executive programs, I'll post a job with a description of someone who looks just like Corinne, wait the 1 week I have to wait by my company's rules, and then just hire the person I was going to hire anyway. So most of the stuff you see listed isn't actually real. But I digress. Back to the prototypes, you can have an information interview, which is a great way to find out if the thing that you're interested in doing even exists and whether it's really the thing you think it is. You can spend a day shadowing someone. This is fantastic. Students do it. Professionals do it. It's amazing the kind of information you get about people and the conversations you'll have during that day that might take you down new paths. What we call a pop-up experience. We often run some of our most popular classes now at Stanford, last a day or two or 3 a weekend. So you can create pop-up experiences to see if you wanted to do the thing you want to do. One of the things we do with entrepreneurs is have them, just pop up a version of the product or service that they want to offer in its crudest form and see if they like selling it for a weekend. We're actually about to head off to Makers Fair here in the Valley. This weekend is the big Makers Fair event, and I've got 8 of my students' team at Makers Fair trying to see if one, if people really like the products they've come up with, and 2, if they really like spending 48 hours in selling mode. If not, they're probably not entrepreneurs. You can create internships. Everybody loves to have an intern, and they even love it even more if you don't have to pay them. A 1 week unpaid experience doing what you want to do, which is surprisingly available. You'd be amazed at the number of yeses you get when you offer to be the intern for a week. Even I don't care if you're 16, 22, 35, or 50. And then internships. Although we also internships should become farther down the line. A 3-month engagement in some kind of an organizational opportunity is a pretty expensive prototype in terms of time and money. And what I've found in interviewing all of my students who all go off and do internships in the summers is that they knew within the first week or so whether this job was the kind of job that they would really get excited about in the future. And so the rest of the other 9 or 10 weeks of the internship were pretty much sort of step and repeat. Although I have taught them that, and while you're the intern, your opportunity to have informational interviews is enormous. I mean, you can even take the CEO out for a cup of coffee and find out how he or she got to be CEO. So these are all ways in which you can prototype your way into a future that has a little more data around it. So pick a problem you're dealing with in your career. Here's my challenge to you. Pick a problem you're dealing with. Brainstorm at least 3, as always 3, never less than 3. 3 to 5 is great. 3 completely different ways you might approach or solve this problem. Ask yourself, what's the fastest, low-resolution way you have to ask the question embedded in my solution? So we had an executive who was, a pretty successful executive in a high-tech firm, but had always wanted to, had a sort of a dream of opening a restaurant, always wanted to open a restaurant, and sold all her stock, quit her job, found a location, spent 6 months designing this amazing restaurant and restaurant experience, opened the restaurant and discovered it was very, very successful, and 6 months in was miserable. And we asked her why. And she said, well, I realized after what I liked was designing the restaurant. Actually running a restaurant, it's just a lot of hard work. And then people come and complain about the food, and the staff doesn't show up on time. She said, it's not any fun at all. And we were thinking, gosh, that's a pretty expensive prototype to run. You quit your job, you sold all your stock, you invested everything in the restaurant. Luckily, she was able to sell the restaurant at a profit. But she could have prototyped, take a week off and be the house manager, in a friend's restaurant or something to discover whether or not that would have worked. But the question she failed to ask was, what would it actually be like to operate this on a day-to-day basis, not to design this? And she could have unlocked that with a much simpler prototype. So find out the fastest, lowest resolution way you have to ask the question, and then develop a prototype that is actually available and cheap. Now, availability is this idea of wayfinding. What is actually available to me? I can't probably go become the CEO of a major tech company and try it out. That's not available. It is available over to network on LinkedIn, find a couple of friends who know some people who are senior executives in organizations, and take them out for a cup of coffee, spend a day shadowing them, or offering to be their intern for a week. So what I'd like to do is the same challenge we had last time. If folks are interested in trying this and they want to report back on their progress, either with the gratefulness exercise or with the interesting, prototypes that they've run, report back to me and let me know how it worked. We'll try to correlate that stuff, make it non-personal information, and figure out how to share it with people who participate. So that's it. I think we've got maybe 10 minutes for some questions. Just the takeaways would be, we do believe you can design your life, and frankly, you have to, because if your life is going to happen whether you design it or not. The only question is whether it's going to be a good design or something ad hoc. Really, it's just a series of decisions, but to make good decisions, you have to develop your discernment, and discernment is more than just logical decision-making. It includes the intuitive, the emotional, the spiritual, and the physical information that you have at your disposal. Gratefulness exercises amplifies positive affect and creates a sense of well-being and a sense of engagement in the world, which helps you to discern what's working for you. You can prototype any kind of future experience, start with low res, look for an interesting question, and practice in life makes perfect, and frankly, what else are you going to do? I mean, either life's going to happen or you're going to design it, and you're either going to get better and better at it by being in a constant learning mode, which is the sort of design thinking, empathy, prototype mode, or not. Kind of up to you. Yeah, we've got a bunch of questions here, and we probably can't get to all of them, but I've got 3 that I think are kind of interesting. One says, any advice on how you start with low-resolution prototypes and solutions? Being an engineer, I have trouble not being able to start unless I have a high-fidelity solution with all the permutations thought through, or at least well listed. So, I mean, this is a great question, and it gets us to the domain. My idea of what's the domain of the problem. Engineering. I'm trained as an engineer, and engineering thinking, powerful way to solve problems. You list all of the possible permutations of a solution, and you optimize the solution. Now, for an engineering problem to work, you have to have enough data. The system has to essentially be a closed system. It has to be knowable, what is knowable. And if you have unknowns, you have to have enough information so that you can solve for the unknown. But if you have an engineering problem, this is a pretty good approach, right, to optimize around all the data and come up with one good or one optimum solution. Fantastic. Now, let's go to the domain of the problems we've been talking about. Designing your life, designing a new product for people whose needs are just emerging. Like we don't even really know. Before we had smartphones, you didn't know you needed one. It wasn't clear that was the right direction. It's a kind of an unbounded space. So design thinking works best when the problem is unbounded, where you can't get data about the future, and where over-investing in the kind of prototype and solution that was described in this problem it's going to turn out to be a waste of time and money. Because although you've optimized around everything you know, as soon as you propose the solution, the user, you, or in this case, are just going to change your mind, and you're going to say, that's not what I want anymore. Now that I've seen what you've shown me, this optimized solution, I don't want it. And now an engineer will say, but that's not fair. You told me this, you gave me all the parameters, I gave you exactly what you wanted, and now you've changed your mind. But that's just the way it is with human beings. We change our mind when the situation is exposed, and that's why you're going to fail, and you want to fail fast, and you want to fail early in the process. Failing meaning, asking a question, building a low-resolution prototype, discovering that's not what works at all for you, and then moving to the next prototype. Because if you over-invest in the solution, i.e. you quit your job and open a restaurant, only to discover you hate running restaurants, you've spent too much time and too much energy and money, in this case, on prototyping something for which you could have gotten that data much more quickly. So remember, engineering solutions for engineering problems, design solutions for design problems. There was another question, how do you prototype decisions that are one-shot, that can't be made again for instance, the critical ones like choosing one's career. This is an interesting question because embedded in it is the notion that I am going to choose a career and then I am going to act on that career. So I deal with this question all the time. My students come in and they say, what should I major in? And they pick a major and they go, well, if I major in engineering, I got to be an engineer the rest of my life. If I major in psychology, of course, I'm going to be a counselor. If I major in computer science, I'm going to be a programmer. And it's like, and the data, if you want to think that way, you can think it's a one-shot decision, but the data is quite clear. For instance, with respect to college majors, only 20% of the students 10 years out of school will be doing anything professionally that had anything to do with the qualifications they received in their major, i.e. they majored in mechanical engineering and now they're using mechanical engineering in their career. So it just doesn't work that way. The fact is, and particularly for this generation and whatever generation you are, it's been true for a long time now that everyone will have at least two completely different careers in their lives, which utilize on different skill sets and different strengths. And probably this generation, which will live to be 100 and work for 60 or 70 years, will have at least 3 different careers. So the notion that it's a one-shot deal is not true. You can hold that opinion if you want, but the data tells us that's not true. And in fact, isn't it better if it's not true? Would you really like your 18-year-old self who went to college and picked a major to decide what your 50-year-old self has to do now? I mean, are you sure the counsel from that 18-year-old is the counsel you want to listen to? Don't you think something has changed in your life and in your experiences? And haven't you grown in certain core strengths and observational abilities for which you would now be so much better suited for a different potential career? Again, I'm not arguing that, if you have one career and you love it. I've had a career in design and I've loved it, but it's been as an engineer, as a designer, as a project and company leader, as an entrepreneur, now as an educator, and my next career will be purely as an artist, where I'm going to practice my love of creation and design, but not on the market's terms, on my terms. So I think the notion that a career decision is a one-shot deal, I'm hoping to blow up because the data tells us that is not true. And then there was one more question I thought was really kind of fun. Oh, can this be applied to testing relationships? And the two relationships they suggest are maybe with a new business partner or even with a spouse. Okay, so I'm going to kind of somewhat opt out of the spouse question. I absolutely think you can prototype relationships. I think it's probably one of the most important things to do, and that's where your discernment and your emotional intelligence and your ability to sit quietly with yourself and understand, is this love or is this infatuation? Is this truly passion or is this just, something that will fade next weekend? Those are really important questions, but I don't know that I'm qualified to speak to that. I do know that a critical, we do this all the time. We have a class called Launchpad where you have to actually, it's an entrepreneurship class taught by my colleague Perry Claiborne. And in the 10-week quarter, because we have short quarters here at Stanford, you have to conceive, design, launch, and create your company. So, and the critical part of that is forming the partnerships that will create companies. The data on entrepreneurship is really clear. Single entrepreneurs are rarely as successful as pairs or trios. Anything past a trio is pretty fragile and doesn't work. So we're constantly forming and reforming pairs of entrepreneurship teams for this class. And we go through a rigorous process of testing. How are you with conflict? How are you with, what is your communication style? Do the styles match? All of those things can be simulated, prototyped, built, and experienced. And that's where your gut's going to tell you, probably within a couple of days, if you really are serious about, a partnership, business partnership, of simulating all the experiences, not the easy ones, like, hey, everybody loves our company and they gave us $5 million, but that we have no money, no one likes our business plan, and we're fighting over direction. If you can easily simulate those kinds of situations and discover what people's behavior is and how their behavior works for you. There is no right or wrong kind of partnership other than one that, where the communication works, where conflicts can be resolved and people can get on the same page. that can happen with lots and lots of different personality types, lots of different learning styles, lots of different, kind of organizational styles. But that's something that you absolutely can prototype and discover upfront whether or not the partnership will work for you. There's a couple of things. You can pull from other sort of relationship psychology, but there's a thing in psychology about sort of the 1-to-5 ratio. For every conflict you have with a partner, you need to have 5, positive engagements in order for the partnership to be operational, both in business operation and in personal relationships. So if you can't find a sort of 1-to-5 ratio of conflict to positive engagements with someone you're considering partnering with, our suggestion would be that's probably not going to be a viable long-term partnership. Lots more to say about relationships and stuff, but I won't get into that now. I think we're pretty much out of time, so I'll turn it back to Corinne.
So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. There will be more information to come with the recording sent out within a week. Have a great day.